In this video, I'm going to do some exploration of some data to try to work towards a data visual recommendation. And I'm going to be using Ohio University enrollment data. I tried to find similar data for Miami, but I couldn't, so I decided to use this data, and it is where I went to school. So I'm going to look at this enrollment data, which is from 1861 to 2020. And the data comes in this long table. I won't show you the whole table, but you can see that at the time that Ohio first began, there weren't that many students in school, so it's not going to make too much sense to use a big graph for all of this data if I'm trying to just focus on certain parts of it. For example, the first part of it, there aren't that many students. So the way I decided to graph it was using a bar chart. And you can see that it wasn't until about 1866 that they even had close to 250 students. And really, I wouldn't even need that gold bar that says total, because at the time, females were not permitted to enroll in the college, so there were only males that were being enrolled. So now we look at 1899 to 1910, and you can see that at this point, females are being enrolled, and maybe the reason that there's a gap in the data between 1867 and 1899, maybe this is the year that they started admitting females. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But you'll notice that the overall number of students is going up. And so, a little background, not too many people went to college in those days, and not that many women went to college in those days, and in fact had not been permitted to go to college throughout most of history. So you can see that, it's steadily growing, but there's still more males than females, but it does seem to start to even out by 1910. So now I'm looking at 1910 to 1921, and something interesting is happening here because suddenly the female enrollment is outpacing male enrollment. And there may be some reasons for that. I do know that, we all know that World War I occurred, and in that would explain 1917, 1918. Also, there was a pandemic, and it really did heavily affect young males. So maybe that's part of the reason for 1918 to 1920. But it doesn't necessarily explain why the enrollment of women went up so much. So possibly that's when the university added a teaching program and a teaching training program of some kind, and maybe that's why you see more women enrolling, because that was one of the fields that was open to women at that point. So now we're looking at the 20th century from the beginning to about 1960, and here you can see a little story happening. There was a little bit of a dip. You can really see it now during the time that we were in World War I, and then the enrollment starts to go up again, and then suddenly it dips drastically for males during the time period of World War II. But then it goes up just as drastically for males after World War II when the GI Bill went into effect. Then you see another slight dip. Well, it's kind of a big dip, really, in the early 50s, and maybe that has something to do with the Korean War. And then you start to see the numbers going up again. Now I have the whole 20th century here. And at this point, it's really hard to say much about anything about the beginning of the century because the numbers are so much lower. By the end, after World War II, the numbers got over 5,000. The numbers of both males and females were steadily going up. And you see this huge spike in enrollment in the late 60s. And that had a lot to do with the Vietnam War, because of student deferments. So if you were going to college, you would not get drafted. And there was also a lot more financial aid available because the U.S. government had felt that higher education was a matter of national security during the Cold War. So that might also figure into it. But then you'll notice this big drop again in the early 70s. And we left Vietnam in 1975. And also, you might be aware of some of the riots and shootings, such as at Kent State. There was a lot of unrest on college campuses, and a lot of them got shut down early in 1970. And OU was one of the ones that got shut down early. And there was a lot of bad feelings towards these universities after all this happened, and that might have figured into some of the lower enrollments subsequently to those unrestful times. And then about the time that I went there in the 80s, the enrollment was not as high as it is today, but it was still on its way back up. And let's see, let's look at it from, the data goes to 2018. So you can see that when we look at it even over a longer time period, the dips and rises disappear even further at the beginning of the school's history. That spike during the Vietnam War is still really visible. But what you can also see is that after the Vietnam War, there had become ingrained in Americans this expectation that everybody should go to college. So there is a steady rise in enrollment, and it does get higher than the peak of the Vietnam War. So it does get to be around 23,000 at a certain point. And then you can notice at the very tail end of the graph where the data ends, you can start to see that the numbers are going down. And what we do know is that there is going to be a lower graduation rate from high school because of a lower birth rate from the upcoming generation. So that's part of it. But also college has gotten so expensive that a lot of people are doing other things besides going to college. So anyway, this is just looking at the data from another number of perspectives. From, I could take the data for the more recent years and use some bar graphs or something like that. But what I was really interested in myself when I was looking at this data is I keep hearing everybody talking about how enrollment is drastically dropping. But then when you look at it historically, it is dropping, but nowhere near to the levels that it had been historically. So it's kind of interesting to see that a lot of our perspective about what is a drastic drop can be relative. So what is the recommendation? It really would depend on what my audience wanted to know. And I was just exploring the data at this point and in looking at how to best represent that data. And I was using my own knowledge of history to speculate about what was happening. So I don't have any sources here. So what I would need to find out is what my audience wants to know. I need a prompt. And then I need to know what part of the data is important to that task. And then what information beyond the data set will provide clues to answer what the numbers mean. So that's where I am right now, and I thank you for listening.